The day began like any other at St. Mary's General Hospital, a bustling hub of medical care where lives are saved and compassion is paramount, or at least, that's the image it projects. Behind the sterile walls and pristine uniforms, something more troubling is brewing. Angela Parker, a skilled and dedicated black nurse, was about to find out just how deep those tensions ran. Today, she would be tested, not by a medical emergency, but by a battle she never signed up for, one of dignity and respect. As Angela entered the brightly lit hallway, her mind was set on the patients, the charts, and the rounds she had meticulously prepared for. But what she hadn't prepared for was the frosty reception from Dr. William Graves, a senior doctor known for his clinical excellence, but also for his condescending manner. It wasn't her first encounter with a dismissive colleague, but this one stung more than most. "Miss Parker," Dr. Graves called out in a loud, commanding voice, pausing just long enough for the nearby staff and even patients to notice. Angela turned toward him, a polite smile on her face, eager to respond and eager to show that she was a professional, ready to contribute to the team. But instead of acknowledging her with respect, Dr. Graves' eyes narrowed. "I expect nothing but the highest standards from all my staff," he began, his tone dripping with cold superiority. "Let's hope you're up to those standards," he added, his gaze lingering on her as if to suggest she wasn't. Angela stood frozen, not because of the words themselves, but because of where and how they were delivered, publicly, in front of patients and other nurses. It was as if Dr. Graves had intentionally chosen this moment to assert his dominance, making an example of her. Yet, what he didn't realize was that one particular patient in the room had caught every word. And that patient wasn't just any patient. Angela, her hands trembling slightly, remained poised. She had learned over the years that moments like these, though painful, were fleeting. But it didn't take away the sting of humiliation, the unfairness of being singled out when all she had done was work hard, maybe even harder than most, to be where she was. Without breaking her stride, she replied calmly, "Thank you, Dr. Graves. I'll do my best." Her voice was steady, but inside, a fire was building. Not just from this incident, but from a lifetime of being judged before being given a fair chance. As Dr. Graves turned on his heel and disappeared down the hallway, Angela returned to her duties. What she didn't know was that her silent observer, lying in the hospital bed just a few feet away, was more than just a passive participant in the day's events. This patient had influence, power even, far beyond anything Angela or Dr. Graves could have imagined. Thomas Edwards, the patient with both arms in casts after a skiing accident, had been quietly observing the hospital for days. His face may have been expressionless during the doctor's outburst, but inside, he was taking careful mental notes. His time here was meant for recovery, but now, it seemed, he had a different mission in mind. Angela continued her rounds, each step a reminder that she was in this hospital not to prove herself to anyone, but to provide the care and dedication her patients deserved. Yet, as she walked past the room of Mr. Edwards, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something she wasn't yet aware of. It would soon become clear that Dr. Graves had underestimated both Angela and the man he had overlooked in that hospital bed. And as Angela left for the day, she couldn't have known that the simple exchange that morning was the first tremor of a much larger earthquake about to shake St. Mary's to its core. Little did anyone know, the next time Angela would see Mr. Edwards, her life, and perhaps the entire hospital, would be on the verge of an extraordinary transformation. What would happen when the true identity of the quiet patient in room 412 was revealed? And how would Dr. Graves respond when he realized who had been watching him all along? Stay tuned for part 2, because this story is only just beginning. Angela could feel the weight of the day pressing on her as she walked to the bus stop, her mind swirling with a mix of emotions. The hospital had always been a place where she found purpose, but today it felt more like a battlefield. Dr. Graves' public humiliation still stung, and the whispers that followed her down the hall hadn't helped. She could handle the usual pressures of the job, but the constant undercurrent of judgment and the need to prove herself over and over again was exhausting. As the evening air brushed against her face, Angela tried to clear her head. She replayed the moment in her mind, wondering if she could have said or done something different. But deep down, she knew there was nothing more she could have done. She was a professional, and she had handled the situation with grace, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. What gnawed at her most wasn't just the disrespect from Dr. Graves, but the fact that it was public, right in front of a patient. She glanced back at the hospital, her thoughts drifting to Mr. Edwards, the patient who had been quietly observing. He hadn't said a word, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made Angela feel like he understood more than he let on. Who was this man? The next morning, Angela arrived at the hospital, determined to focus on her work and put yesterday behind her. As she made her way through the halls, the usual morning buzz surrounded her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a certain tension in the air, something unspoken. People were watching her again, but this time it wasn't just curiosity. It felt heavier, like they knew something she didn't. Angela headed straight to her first task of the day, checking on Mr. Edwards. She knocked softly and entered the room, where she found him sitting up, his eyes scanning a newspaper spread across his lap. He looked up when she walked in, his gaze meeting hers with a steady calmness that made her pause. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, moving to check his vitals. "Morning, Nurse Parker," he replied, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of something deeper, like he was weighing his words carefully. "How's everything today? Busy morning?" Angela nodded. "Just the usual," she said, trying to keep her tone light, though she could feel his eyes on her as she worked. He was watching her again, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of scrutiny she was used to from other patients. It felt more like he was assessing her, observing not just what she was doing but who she was. "Yesterday was quite something," he said after a moment, folding his newspaper. "That doctor, Greaves, seemed intense." Angela's hand stilled for a second before she resumed checking his blood pressure. "He can be," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "He's very committed to the hospital." Mr. Edwards nodded, but his eyes stayed on her, unblinking. "Commitment is important, sure, but respect is too. Do you always get treated that way around here?" Angela hesitated, unsure how to answer. She wasn't in the habit of discussing workplace dynamics with patients, especially one she barely knew. But there was something about Mr. Edwards that made her want to be honest, even though she didn't know why. "Sometimes," she finally said, glancing up at him. "But I learned to focus on the work. Patients come first always." He seemed to take this in, his expression thoughtful. "That's admirable," he said, "but it doesn't mean it's right." Angela wasn't sure how to respond. Before she could say anything else, the door opened and Dr. Graves strode in, clipboard in hand, his usual commanding presence filling the room. He didn't look at Angela as he started speaking, addressing Mr. Edwards in a tone that was overly formal, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Edwards, I trust you're feeling better today." Dr. Graves asked, his eyes briefly flicking to Angela, but quickly moving away. Mr. Edwards nodded, but there was something almost amused in his expression as he responded. "Much better, thank you. Though I can't say the same for your bedside manner yesterday, Doctor. Quite the performance." Dr. Graves froze for a split second, his jaw tightening, but he quickly recovered, forcing a tight smile. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. We run a tight ship here, and sometimes things can get a little tense. I assure you, our focus is always on patient care." Angela's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, pretending to focus on her tasks as the conversation played out. Mr. Edwards simply nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Dr. Graves. "I'm sure it is," he said, his tone polite but carrying an undertone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Dr. Graves seemed eager to wrap up the conversation. "Well, I'll leave you in Nurse Parker's capable hands," he said, casting Angela a quick glance before turning on his heel and leaving the room. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Angela busied herself with adjusting Mr. Edwards' IV, avoiding his gaze. "Interesting man," Mr. Edwards said after a beat, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I wonder if he realizes who he's really dealing with." Angela looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Edwards smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say people aren't always who they seem, Nurse Parker. Sometimes, the ones who think they're in control are the ones who have the most to lose." Angela wasn't sure how to respond to that. There was something cryptic about his words, something that hinted at a much bigger picture than she could understand in that moment. "Keep doing what you're doing," he added, his voice softening. "You're better than they realize." Angela felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and a strange sense of anticipation, like she was standing on the edge of something bigger than herself. But before she could ask anything more, Mr. Edwards picked up his newspaper again, effectively signaling the end of the conversation. As she left the room, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Edwards than met the eye. His words played over in her mind, and the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface at the hospital now seemed to be building toward something more. Something was coming, she could feel it. But what? And what role would she play when it all came to light? For now, all she could do was keep her head down and focus on her work. But that lingering sense of unease told her that her time flying under the radar was running out. Angela walked through the hospital hallways, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite shake. Mr. Edwards' words lingered in the back of her mind, and though she had more pressing matters to attend to, she couldn't help but replay their conversation. Who is this man, really? His cryptic comments, his careful observations, everything about him suggested that he was more than just an ordinary patient. But why would someone with such a presence end up here, quietly watching as things unfolded around him? Angela continued her rounds, but she was more distracted than usual. The tension in the hospital seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Nurses were whispering more than usual, conversations halted as she approached, and even the patients seemed aware that something was simmering beneath the surface. The usual rhythm of hospital life was off, and Angela could feel it in the air. Later in the afternoon, as she moved to check on another patient, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues. They were standing just around the corner from the nurse's station, their voices low but urgent. "I'm telling you, there's something going on with that guy in room 412, one of them whispered. "Edwards?" the other asked, glancing nervously over their shoulder. "What about him?" "I don't know exactly," the first nurse replied, lowering her voice even more. "But I heard from one of the administrators that he's connected. Like, really connected. They're all treating him with kid gloves because of who he is." Angela's heart skipped a beat. So, it wasn't just her imagination. There was more to Mr. Edwards than he was letting on. But connected to what? And why was Dr. Graves, who usually strutted around the hospital like he owned the place, acting so careful around him? As the nurses moved on, Angela stood frozen, absorbing this new piece of information. It explained why Mr. Edwards had such a quiet confidence about him, why he watched everything so carefully. But it also meant something much bigger was at play, something she wasn't sure she was ready to be involved in. She headed back toward Mr. Edwards' room, her steps slow as she pieced together what little she knew. She had never seen Dr. Graves defer to anyone the way he had with Mr. Edwards, and the way the hospital staff spoke about him hinted at something more significant. But Angela was no stranger to navigating unspoken power dynamics. She had been doing it for most of her career, balancing respect, professionalism, and the quiet resilience her mother had instilled in her. As she entered Mr. Edwards' room again, she found him sitting up, watching the television, though his attention seemed elsewhere. He looked over at her and smiled, but this time his smile was more guarded, as though he, too, was weighing his next words. "Ah, Nurse Parker," he said, lowering the volume on the TV. "Good to see you again." Angela nodded, moving to check his vitals. "Just making sure you're still on the mend, Mr. Edwards." "Please call me Thomas," he said, his tone lighter, but Angela could feel the shift. The ease of their previous conversations had been replaced by something more careful, more intentional. "Thomas," Angela repeated, but as she did, she felt like she was crossing into unfamiliar territory. "You're healing well. I'll make sure everything is set for your discharge." He chuckled softly. "I'm sure you will, though I suspect there are other things on your mind." Angela glanced at him, but his expression gave nothing away. She wasn't sure if he was just reading the situation or if he knew more than he was letting on. Either way, she couldn't afford to tip her hand. "I'm just focused on my work," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "That's all." Mr. Edwards, or Thomas, gave her a look that made her feel like he could see right through her words. "Focused on your work, sure. But it must be hard with everything going on around here." Angela's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes never leaving her face. "The hospital, the staff. Seems like you've been dealt a rough hand lately. Greaves, the way the others look at you. I've noticed." Angela stayed silent, unsure of how much to say. She wanted to trust him, but she barely knew him, and yet she couldn't deny that he was right. The way Dr. Graves had treated her was just the tip of the iceberg. There were whispers about her, judgments she had felt every time she walked into a room, and the pressure to prove herself was a constant weight on her shoulders. Before she could respond, the door opened and Dr. Graves walked in, his expression tense as usual. He barely acknowledged Angela as he made his way to the bedside, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Graves said, his voice tight. "I wanted to go over your discharge plans. You'll need to follow up with your specialist after you leave here. We've arranged for everything to be taken care of." Thomas nodded, but his eyes flicked briefly to Angela, as if the conversation they had been having was still lingering in the air. Dr. Graves seemed oblivious to the tension, too focused on maintaining his usual air of control. "I trust everything has been to your satisfaction, Mr. Edwards?" Dr. Graves asked, though the question sounded more like a formality than genuine concern. "It has," Thomas replied smoothly, though his tone held a subtle edge. "But I'm still curious about something, Doctor." Dr. Graves raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting a question. "Curious? About what?" "About how your staff is treated here," Thomas said, his gaze now directly on Angela. "Particularly, Nurse Parker." Angela's breath caught in her throat as both men turned their attention to her. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Dr. Graves' face tightened, and for the first time, Angela saw a flicker of something close to fear in his eyes. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Graves said slowly, his voice carefully measured, "I assure you, we have the highest standards here at St. Mary's." "Do you?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but pointed. "Because from what I've seen, it seems like certain people are held to different standards than others." Angela's heart pounded in her chest as the tension in the room grew unbearable. Dr. Graves, clearly rattled, struggled to maintain his composure. I'm not sure what you mean," he stammered, his gaze flicking between Thomas and Angela. Thomas leaned back against the pillows, his expression still unreadable. "Maybe it's just my perspective as a patient, but I think it's something worth looking into." Dr. Graves swallowed hard, his usual air of arrogance completely gone. "I'll make sure everything is reviewed, Mr. Edwards." "See that you do," Thomas said, his voice still calm but with a weight that suggested he wasn't to be dismissed. As Dr. Graves quickly excused himself from the room, Angela stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Thomas had not only called out Dr. Graves, but he had done it in a way that suggested he had the power to do much more. "Thank you," Angela said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled, but it was a knowing smile, one that hinted at secrets she still wasn't privy to. "Don't thank me yet," he said, his tone gentle. "Things are just starting to get interesting." As Angela left the room, her mind raced. Whatever was happening at St. Mary's, it was bigger than her, bigger than the hospital, and for the first time, she realized that she was no longer just a nurse doing her job. She was part of something much larger, something that was about to change everything. Angela's mind was spinning as she stepped out of Mr. Edwards' room. The conversation she had just witnessed between him and Dr. Graves had left her shaken. Thomas Edwards wasn't just any patient, he was someone with influence, someone who could push back against the treatment she'd been quietly enduring. But why? Why had he chosen to take her side, and what exactly was his connection to the hospital? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every interaction felt charged with tension, like a storm gathering strength just beneath the surface. Angela moved through her tasks with a quiet focus, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the look on Dr. Graves' face when Thomas had questioned him. It was fear, real, unmistakable fear. And if someone like Dr. Graves was scared, then Angela knew that whatever was coming next would be big. As the day wore on, Angela noticed subtle shifts in the behavior of her colleagues. Whispers followed her in the hallways, but they were no longer the usual murmurs of exclusion. Now, it felt like people were watching her more closely, as if waiting for something to happen. Some nurses, the ones who had barely acknowledged her existence, now offered polite nods or even hesitant smiles. Others avoided eye contact altogether, keeping their distance as if sensing the undercurrent of change. By the time her shift ended, the air in the hospital was thick with anticipation. Angela gathered her things, ready to head home, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. As she walked through the hospital lobby, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a text from her mother, a simple message checking in. "How was your day, baby girl? Hope you're keeping your head up." Angela smiled, her mother's words always a source of strength. She was about to reply when she felt a presence beside her. She looked up to see Dr. Graves standing there, his face tight with barely concealed frustration. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice cold. "A word." Angela's heart skipped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, doctor." Without another word, Dr. Graves motioned for her to follow him. They walked in silence, the tension between them palpable. He led her into a small, windowless office, closing the door behind them. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow, making the room feel even more suffocating. Dr. Graves turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to be blunt with you, Parker. Whatever it is you think you're doing, you need to stop." Angela blinked, unsure of what he meant. "I'm not sure I understand, Doctor." Dr. Graves took a step closer, his voice lowering. "I don't know what you've been telling Mr. Edwards, but you're walking on thin ice. He's a powerful man, but that doesn't give you the right to involve yourself in matters that don't concern you." Angela's chest tightened. So, this was about Thomas Edwards. But what had she done to provoke such a reaction from Greaves? She had barely said anything to Mr. Edwards beyond the usual nurse-patient interactions, and yet here she was, being warned like she was some kind of threat. "I've only done my job," Angela said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "I treated Mr. Edwards the same as any other patient." Dr. Graves' jaw clenched. "Don't play games with me. You think I haven't noticed the way you've been positioning yourself? You're trying to undermine me, trying to gain favor with Edwards. But let me make this clear, you don't belong here, Parker. You're a token, a diversity hire, and the moment you step out of line, I will make sure you're out of this hospital faster than you can blink." Angela's breath caught in her throat. The words stung, not because she hadn't heard them before in various forms, but because of how bluntly they were delivered now. She could feel the heat rising in her, the desire to lash out, to defend herself. But she held it in. She couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Is that all, Doctor?" she asked, her voice cold. Dr. Graves' eyes flickered with anger at her calm response. He opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, there was a knock at the door. Angela turned just as the door opened, and there stood Thomas Edwards, his expression unreadable. "Am I interrupting something?" Thomas asked, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable weight. Dr. Graves visibly tensed, but he quickly forced a smile. "Mr. Edwards." "No, not at all. Just having a routine conversation with one of my nurses." Thomas stepped into the room, his gaze shifting between Angela and Dr. Graves. "Is that so? Because it sounded like a bit more than routine from out in the hall." Angela's heart raced. She hadn't even noticed that the door hadn't fully latched when they'd entered the room. Thomas must have heard the entire conversation. She glanced at Dr. Graves, whose face had gone pale. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Graves began, but Thomas cut him off with a raised hand. "Dr. Graves, I think you and I need to have a serious conversation. But right now, I'm more interested in hearing from Nurse Parker." Angela's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what Thomas was planning, but whatever it was, Dr. Graves didn't seem prepared for it. The doctor looked like he was about to protest, but instead, he just nodded stiffly. "Of course," Dr. Graves said, his voice strained. "But I'd like to remind both of you that I have a spotless record here at St. Mary's." Thomas didn't acknowledge the comment. He simply gestured toward the door. "We'll talk soon, Doctor. For now, I think it's best if you leave." Dr. Graves hesitated, his eyes darting between them, but after a moment, he turned and walked out of the room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Angela and Thomas alone. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Angela stood there, unsure of what to say or do. Thomas watched her for a moment before finally speaking. "That man has been running this place like his own little kingdom," Thomas said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "But I've seen enough." Angela frowned, confused. "Seen enough of what?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The way he treats people, the way this hospital operates. It's not just about medical care. There's a culture here. a toxic one, and it's time for that to change. Angela's heart pounded in her chest. She'd had suspected something like this for a while, but hearing Thomas say it out loud felt like confirmation of everything she had quietly endured. The unfair workloads, the supple slights, the dismissive attitudes, it all fit into the larger picture he was painting. But why me? Angela asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you getting involved? Thomas smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. Because I've been watching, Nurse Parker. I've been watching how you handle yourself, how you navigate all of this with dignity and professionalism. You've been put through more than most, and yet, here you are, still standing, still doing your job better than anyone else. Angela felt a lump in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She didn't want to cry, not now. You're not alone in this anymore, Thomas continued. I've got resources, influence, and I plan to use them, but I need you on board. Angela blinked, her mind racing. On board with what? Whatever this was, it was bigger than just her or Dr. Graves. It sounded like Thomas had something planned, something that could shake the hospital to its core. But what exactly did he want her to do? Before she could ask, Thomas stepped closer, his expression serious. We're going to expose the truth, Angela, but it's going to get messy before it gets better. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Angela knew, deep down, that whatever was coming next would change everything. Angela stood there, staring at Thomas, his words echoing in her mind. Expose the truth? Messy before it gets better? Her heart pounded in her chest, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She had always been a fighter, silently enduring the challenges at Street Mary's, but now it seemed like things were about to spiral far beyond anything she had imagined. Thomas Edwards wasn't just offering her help, he was pulling her into something much larger, something that could either liberate her or destroy everything she had worked for. Before Angela could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. She fumbled for it, noticing it was a message from one of the senior nurses. We need to talk. Urgent. Meet me by the supply room ASAP. Angela glanced at Thomas, who was watching her closely, waiting for her answer. But now wasn't the time for decisions. There were too many unknowns swirling around, and she needed more information. She offered Thomas a slight nod. I need to check on something. Can we continue this later? Thomas looked at her, as if trying to gauge whether she was backing out. After a moment, he nodded, his expression softening. Of course. But Angela, he added, his voice quiet yet firm, we don't have much time. Things are already in motion. Angela left the room, her mind racing. What had Thomas meant by already in motion? What was he planning, and how deep did this all go? She made her way to the supply room, her pulse quickening with every step. As she turned the corner, she saw Karen, one of the senior nurses, standing by the door, her face tense and eyes darting nervously around. Karen motioned for Angela to follow her inside, closing the door quickly behind them. The dimly lit room smelled of antiseptics and latex gloves, but the atmosphere was thick with something darker. Secrets waiting to be unveiled. What's going on, Karen? Angela asked, keeping her voice low. Karen sighed, rubbing her temples before speaking. I don't have much time. I've been hearing things about Dr. Graves, about what's happening with Mr. Edwards. It's all connected. Angela frowned, stepping closer. Connected how? Karen glanced at the door, as if making sure no one was listening. Dr. Graves isn't just a controlling doctor with a superiority complex. He's been involved in some shady dealings with the hospital administration. I've heard whispers that he's been falsifying records, cutting corners on treatments, and worse. Some of the higher-ups know, but they've been covering for him because he brings in wealthy clients. Street Mary's is built on reputation, and they don't want anything to threaten that. Angela's stomach dropped. Falsifying records? Cutting corners? She had known Graves was difficult, even discriminatory, but this was something else. This wasn't just about bad behavior. It was dangerous. Lives could be at risk. Why are you telling me this? Angela asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Karen took a deep breath, her expression softening. Because I've seen what you've been through, Angela. And I've seen the way Graves and the others treat you. But you're stronger than they realize, and now with Mr. Edwards involved, things are changing. People are talking, and it's only a matter of time before everything comes crashing down. Angela's mind raced. If what Karen was saying was true, then Street Mary's wasn't just a toxic workplace, it was a ticking time bomb. And with Mr. Edwards pulling strings behind the scenes, that bomb was about to go off. "Why now?" Angela asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you coming to me now?" Karen hesitated before answering. "Because I don't think you're safe, Angela. Graves knows something is happening with Mr. Edwards, and he's getting desperate. I heard him talking with someone from administration earlier today. They're planning to push you out before things get worse. He's going to make sure you take the fall if this all blows up." Angela felt her blood run cold. Graves was setting her up, just like he hinted earlier. The weight of it hit her all at once. All the subtle slights, the impossible workloads, the public humiliations. They were part of a larger plan to make her the scapegoat. If the hospital went under scrutiny, it wouldn't be Graves who faced the consequences. It would be her. "I can't let that happen," Angela said, her voice firm despite the panic rising in her chest. "But I don't know how to stop it." Karen stepped closer, her voice low but urgent. "Mr. Edwards, whatever he's doing, he's your best shot. But you need to be careful, Angela. Greaves has been in control for a long time, and people like him don't go down without a fight." Angela nodded, her heart pounding. She had to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that Thomas Edwards wasn't just a lifeline, he was her only way out. But what Karen had just revealed made everything more dangerous. If Graves was involved in something illegal, then this wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about survival. Angela left the supply room with her mind racing. She needed to find Thomas, and fast. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, it was reaching a breaking point, and if she didn't act soon, she would be the one caught in the fallout. As she made her way back through the hospital, the familiar hallways felt different, like they were closing in on her. The once routine world of patient care now felt like a battleground, with hidden traps and enemies lurking around every corner. Just as she reached the elevator, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. They're watching you." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She looked around, scanning the hallway, but no one seemed out of place. Her hands shook as she stared at the message. Who had sent it? And what did it mean? They were watching her. How long had she been under surveillance, and by whom? She rushed to find Thomas, her footsteps quickening as the fear and urgency built inside her. When she finally reached his room, the door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the machines powered down. It was as if Thomas Edwards had never been there at all. Angela's heart raced as she stepped inside, her mind scrambling for answers. Where had he gone? Had Graves gotten to him? Had Thomas left on his own terms? Nothing made sense anymore. Suddenly, she spotted a small envelope lying on the bedside table with her name written on the front in neat, cursive handwriting. She picked it up with trembling hands and tore it open, revealing a short note. "Angela, by the time you read this, I will be gone. But don't worry, this is far from over. Trust no one, and be ready. Things are about to get much more complicated." Angela stared at the note, her hands shaking. Gone? Why had he left? And what did he mean by much more complicated? Her mind spun with questions, but there was no time to process. Whatever was happening, it was escalating fast, and Angela was now right in the middle of it. As she stood there, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, drawing closer. Angela's pulse quickened. She slipped the note into her pocket and turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't safe, and the real battle was just beginning. Angela stood frozen by the door, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder. Her mind raced. Thomas was gone, and with him, any sense of stability she'd thought she had. The cryptic note in her pocket burned against her leg, as if it held more weight than its few lines suggested. Trust no one. Be ready. But ready for what? The door creaked open, and Angela braced herself, unsure of who would walk in. It was Karen, the senior nurse who had warned her earlier. Karen's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her and locking it. "We don't have much time," Karen whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "They know?" "Who knows what?" Angela demanded, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. Graves and the administration, Karen replied, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. They know Mr. Edwards was onto them, and they know you're involved now. That's why he left. He had to get out before they silenced him. Angela's pulse quickened. Silenced? The word hung in the air like a threat. Thomas had left, not because he was finished, but because he was running from something bigger than either of them could have imagined. And now, Angela realized she was at the center of it. I have to get out of here, Angela muttered, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what to do next. But Karen shook her head. You can't leave yet, she said, gripping Angela's arm. There's something you need to know, something bigger. I overheard the hospital board talking. They're not just covering for Graves. They've been working with him on a scheme to funnel money from patient treatments into their own pockets. Edwards found out, and they're panicking. Angela felt her stomach drop. The weight of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Dr. Graves being an arrogant, racist doctor. The entire hospital administration was involved in something criminal, and Thomas had been digging into it. That's why they were after him. That's why they were after her. We need to expose this, Angela said, her voice trembling but resolute. We can't let them get away with it. Karen nodded. But it's not just about exposing it, Angela. It's about surviving long enough to do it. They've already started deleting records and manipulating data. If we don't act fast, they'll erase any proof before we can stop them. A sudden wave of determination washed over Angela. She couldn't let this go. Too many people's lives were at stake, and now that she knew the truth, there was no turning back. But how could she, a nurse, fight against an entire hospital administration? Just then, Angela's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out and saw another message from the unknown number. The files you need are in the basement. Room 14. You have one shot. Be careful. Angela looked at Karen, her heart pounding. It's from Thomas, she whispered. He's telling me where to find the evidence. Karen's eyes widened. The basement? That's where they keep the old medical records. If there's anything that can prove what they've been doing, it'll be there. Without another word, Angela and Karen slipped out of the room, moving quickly but quietly through the hospital halls. The sterile, white corridors that had once felt so familiar now felt hostile, like they were closing in on Angela with every step she took. She kept her head down, her senses heightened, every sound making her jump. They reached the basement, an eerie silence filling the space as they descended the stairs. The dim lighting flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. Angela's breath hitched as they approached room 14. It looked like just another storage room, but inside she knew was the key to everything. Karen pulled out her key card and swiped it across the lock. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside. The room was filled with metal filing cabinets, each one labeled with dates and patient numbers. Angela's eyes scanned the room until she spotted a small, unmarked cabinet tucked away in the corner. That's it, Karen whispered, pointing. That's where they keep the off-the-books records. Angela approached the cabinet, her hands trembling as she opened the drawer. Inside were thick folders stuffed with documents, billing records, patient files, transactions that didn't add up. This was it. This was the proof they needed. But just as Angela reached for the files, the door behind them slammed shut. The sound echoed through the basement, and both women spun around to see Dr. Graves standing in the doorway, his face twisted with fury. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? Graves sneered, stepping forward. I warned you, Parker, but you didn't listen. Angela's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through her veins. We know everything, Dr. Graves, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You and the administration have been stealing from patients, endangering lives. It's over. Graves laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down Angela's spine. Over? You think this ends with you finding a few pieces of paper? I've been running this hospital for years, and people like you are nothing but a nuisance. I can make you disappear, Parker, and no one will ever know. Angela felt a surge of fear, but she refused to back down. Thomas Edwards knows, she said, her voice rising, and he's not the only one. You can't hide from this. For a moment, Graves' eyes flickered with uncertainty, but then his expression hardened again. Edwards is gone, and soon you'll be too. Before Angela could react, Karen stepped forward, placing herself between Angela and Greaves. "Not if we expose you first," Karen said, her voice filled with defiance. "It's over, William." Greaves glared at her, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me? You think anyone will believe you?" But just as he spoke, the door behind him creaked open again, and to Angela's shock, a group of police officers entered the room, their weapons drawn. "Dr. William Graves," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit malpractice." Angela felt a wave of relief crash over her as the officers moved in, handcuffing Graves and leading him out of the room. His protests echoed through the hallway, but they were drowned out by the sound of justice finally being served. As the officers left, Angela turned to Karen, her breath shaky, but filled with triumph. "Thomas must have sent them," she said. "He knew this would happen." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We did it, Angela. It's over." But just as the words left her mouth, Angela's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, her pulse quickening as she read the message. "You think this is over? Think again. You're not safe yet." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Karen, the weight of the message sinking in. This wasn't over. Not yet. There was still someone out there, pulling the strings, and they weren't finished with her. The fight for justice had only just begun. Angela stared at the message on her phone, her heart racing again. The relief from seeing Dr. Graves arrested had been short-lived, quickly replaced by the gnawing fear that someone else was still out there, watching, waiting. The weight of the words pressed down on her. "You're not safe yet." She shared a nervous glance with Karen, whose face had paled. They had just uncovered a massive scheme, exposed a corrupt doctor, and yet it seemed the danger wasn't over. There was still someone else, someone more dangerous, pulling the strings behind the scenes. "I thought it was over," Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "So did I," Angela replied, her voice tight. "But there's more going on here than we realized." Angela took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had come too far to back down now. Greaves may have been arrested, but the system that protected him, the one that allowed people like him to thrive in the shadows, was still intact. Whoever had sent that message wasn't just trying to scare her. They were part of something bigger. "We have the files," Angela said, motioning to the cabinet of records. "We can still use these to expose everyone involved." Karen nodded, her eyes determined now. "We need to take them to the authorities. Make sure the investigation doesn't stop with Graves." Angela carefully gathered the most incriminating files, her mind racing with what they would do next. She couldn't afford to think about who might still be watching or what dangers lay ahead. All that mattered now was making sure the truth saw the light of day. As they made their way back upstairs, the hospital was eerily quiet. It was late, and most of the staff had gone home, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred beneath their feet. Angela could feel the weight of the secrets she carried, but there was no turning back now. She had faced too much, endured too many years of being silenced and dismissed. This was her moment to finally fight back. Karen pulled out her phone and dialed the police contact Thomas had provided earlier. After a tense exchange of words, she hung up and turned to Angela. "They're sending someone to meet us at the station. We'll be safe there." Angela nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, even as they moved through the empty corridors. That message, the warning, echoed in her mind. She had been careful, but was it enough? As they exited the hospital, the cool night air hit them like a wave, a brief moment of clarity. The world outside felt so normal, so distant from the chaos and corruption inside Street Mary's. Angela inhaled deeply, trying to clear her head, but she knew there was no escaping the tangled mess she had stepped into. Not yet. They reached Karen's car, loading the files carefully into the back seat before heading toward the police station. The streets were quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of papers in the back. Angela's mind raced with everything that had happened, every twist and turn that had brought her to this point. She thought about Thomas, how he had known from the start, how he had guided her through this without ever revealing his full plan. He had been more than just a patient. He had been the key to exposing everything. But where was he now? Was he safe, or had he gotten too close to something dangerous, something that had forced him to flee? The car stopped at a red light, and Angela glanced out the window, her thoughts wandering. That's when she saw it. A sleek black car parked a few blocks away, its headlights off but engine running. It had been following them. Karen, Angela said, her voice tight with fear, were being followed. Karen glanced in the rearview mirror, her eyes widening in panic. Without a word, she pressed her foot harder on the gas, speeding through the next intersection, trying to lose their tail. Angela's pulse raced. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever had sent that message was watching, and they weren't going to let her walk away with the evidence. The car behind them sped up, closing the gap as they wove through the darkened streets. "We need to get to the station," Karen said through gritted teeth, her hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. "They won't follow us there." But the black car wasn't backing down. Angela looked over her shoulder, watching as it closed in, its dark figure looming larger with every second. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had done the right thing, exposed the truth. Why was it still coming after them? Just as the black car veered dangerously close to them, flashing its headlights in an aggressive burst, Karen swerved onto a side street. The car behind them screeched to a halt, skidding out as Karen floored it, speeding through the narrow road toward the police station just a few blocks away. They pulled up to the station, the building brightly lit, and relief flooded Angela as she saw the uniformed officers waiting for them. Karen slammed on the brakes, and they both jumped out of the car, clutching the files tightly as they ran toward the officers. The black car pulled up down the street, but didn't follow. Angela could see it lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. Whoever was behind it was still out there, but for now, they had made it to safety. Inside the station, Angela and Karen handed over the files, explaining everything to the investigators. The hours that followed were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and tense waiting. But finally, after what felt like a lifetime, they were told that the investigation would be widened, that the files would be used to bring down not just Graves but the entire corrupt network operating within the hospital. Angela sat in the waiting room, exhausted but relieved. It was over. Greaves would face justice, and so would the others who had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. She had always fought quietly, trying to navigate a world that wasn't built for her, a system designed to keep her down. But now, she realized, she didn't have to fight quietly anymore. She could stand tall, speak out, and demand change. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Karen sat beside her, a weary but triumphant smile on her face. "We did it," Karen said softly. Angela nodded, her mind finally at ease. "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady. "We did." But even as they sat there, the message from earlier replayed in Angela's mind. "You're not safe yet." Maybe it was just a final scare tactic, maybe it wasn't. Either way, Angela knew that she wasn't the same person she had been when this all started. She was stronger now, more determined, and if anyone came for her again, she'd be ready.